So this is going to be a series of reflections on the book of John, the fourth of the gospel writers. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are quite distinct and different from John. John can be seen in many ways, and he has been seen in the Christian tradition as the great contemplative theologian, the one who was closest to Jesus' heart, and so who understood in a meaningful, existential manner what it meant to live the fullest life, the eternal life. Not eternal life is, again, it's a Greek word that doesn't mean what happens when you're dead. It's a quality of existence in the present time. And so John's work, the 21 chapters in John, he sums up, he's probably the most philosophic as well of any of the writers of the New Testament, and he draws from the best of the Hebrew tradition, the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition, and tries to point out that in the coming of Christ, the presence of the eternal has touched into time and continues to touch into time in a meaningful manner. But I will, in this particular lecture, look at John chapters 1 to 3. The prologue, John 1 to 14, starts with sort of your usual translation is, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Now, interesting enough, in Greek, it's in einarche ho logos. Arche is a word that its root is archons. The archons were the guardians of the city-states for the Greeks. If John wanted to, it's interesting when it's translated in the beginning, if you start from beginning, that whole passage itself means that there was a beginning between God, Logos, and John would have used chronos. And so why is he using arche, which is a root of archon? So rather than starting the translation in the beginning, it should be at the ground or the guardian of all things. And this is probably closer to what John is trying to get at. So at the ground or the guardian of all things is the logos. And again, logos has been translated as reason, rational principle. But within pre-Socratic thought of Heraclitus and Parmenides, and to some degree Plato, Aristotle, logos did not mean rational principle or discussion. It meant the presencing of that which is. And so if we can look at even the first line, it could be at the source, the guardian of all things is that which is presencing itself. We even get a word dialogos in the English language using the logos as well. For example, Martin Buber, when he talks about I and thou and dialogue, he's talking about the presence of the I as much as we can understand our true I, ourself, engaging the thou or the presencing of the logos of the other, which is present to us. And so logos is a term that John is trying to get at, in which at the ground of all things is the presencing of that which is. And so the historic translation of the beginning of John sometimes misses some of these key elements that John is trying to get at as he draws together the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition, even the Hebrew tradition in that sense. Is that so logos is not just word, rational discussion. It's more about the presence which guards all things being present to us. John then moves on to talk about the light and the darkness not overcoming the light. Now, overcoming in this particular context can be translated in two ways. The particular Greek word here can be understood as overcoming in terms of comprehension, is that darkness cannot overcome a person's understanding of what the light is. But it also is a word that means that the light overcomes in the will darkness. And so when people have tensions and struggles within, whether addictions or a whole range of things, a person can understand cognitively that there's a problem, but that doesn't mean in their will they're overcoming it. And so cognitive understanding is only part of overcoming scotia or darkness by phos, light. And so we'll come up to this word. John will use another word later on. And so, but when it says the darkness doesn't understand or overcome the light, this is both an issue of knowing cognitively, but in the will itself. overcoming these issues. Merely cognitive understanding, as any would know in their life when they're dealing with particular issues. Just to know there's an issue doesn't mean the issue has been overcome. That's an issue of the will. And so overcoming, John will pick up another word later, from which actually the Nike shoes come from. It's an old Greek word, nikao, overcoming. It's more will, much more than just cognitive stuff. So anyway, so when John looks at the overcoming of light of darkness, it brings together both being aware of what the issue is, in terms of the light shining on darkness, but merely the light shining on the darkness doesn't mean it is overcome through the will the darkness. John the Baptist then plays a very significant role, and this becomes a key issue in this story, because within the Jewish tradition itself, they could understand a sage coming along, saying things that were wiser than others, a prophet, because they have a whole history, obviously, of oral, major, minor prophets, arguing for moral truth, justice, peacemaking. And so was Jesus just a prophet in the same line and lineage of John the Baptist or Elijah, Moses, Abraham, in that sense? There's already a sense that John is articulating Jesus does not fit within simple categories by which Jews would have understood their own history, their own intellectual history, their own history of political revolution, like the Zealots at the time or the Maccabees, which have preceded them. He was not a rabbi in that sense. So who was this? And so inevitably the power elite from Jerusalem come to see John and say, and they come to see Jesus as well. Well, who are you? A bit like where you get controversial thinkers like today, for example, if you get a lot of people are interested in Richard Rohr, and the Center for Action and Contemplation. The question is, who is he? Where does he fit within the Roman Catholic tradition? Or Jean Vanier, some of the issues which have circled around him, or the rise of Neo-Calvinism, or Karl Barth, or any of the significant thinkers which emerge. Inevitably, power elites are going to send out their people to say, who are you? Where do you fit within the tradition? We want to know who you are. So just as John was doing the baptizing and Jesus is emerging, the inevitable questions, they send out their lackeys, initially from Jerusalem, which was to be like people being sent out from Rome or something, to say, well, who's this Catholic and what are they saying and where do they fit within the tradition, or Canterbury, or these sorts of things. And so what John is trying to get at is that Jesus is not going to fit within these categories of simple prophet, Elijah. He's something more than that, which is a very interesting discussion for today as well, particularly in interfaith dialogue, where you get Jewish-Christian interfaith dialogue. What they want to essentially argue is that, okay, we can now accept him as a rabbi, a sage, a prophet concerned with social, economic, cultural issues, Roman imperialism, colonialism, but claims beyond that, these are just superimpositions. Jesus really never made those claims for himself, and you'll get certain actually New Testament exegetes arguing that as well. But John's position, in fact, is that these claims came forward, and they reflect a different understanding entirely that positions Christianity in a very different place than Judaism. And in that sense, it's inevitable. There had to be a break when you get the notion that the divine, the Logos, is embodied in human flesh. Now, within the Jewish tradition, they were perpetually warned against this, as in the Islamic tradition. And so Christianity in that self, as John understands it, and as it was revealed to him, is closer to elements of Greek mythic tradition, where the Aphrodite or Dionysius, these divine beings become human, or elements of avatars in Hinduism. And so John, and as he records Jesus' thinking, is obviously articulating an understanding that doesn't fit within, hence the questions that come from thoughtful Jews. It's totally understandable that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Levites, the scribes are going to say, well, who are you? And you're even in your interpretation. And so you get in even John 1, you get verses being quoted from Isaiah and Genesis, in which a total different hermeneutic is being applied to the Hebrew canon, or the Christian Old Testament in that sense. And so John 1 deals with the whole notion in the prologue is that the guardian of all things has become is presencing himself and taking on human flesh, and that inevitably collides with Jewish understandings of the word in that sense. And so John 1 is setting the stage for what's going to come out, a total different interpretation of the Old Testament, a total rethinking of the Jewish tradition to the point where it's not Jewish any significant anymore. And it breaks away, and it's actually closer to elements of Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Scandinavian mythology, Indian mythology, and certain elements of Egyptian mythology, for that matter. Also, the direction that it's going. And so John 1 looks at, and of course then Jesus calling the first four disciples which are going to follow him. Interesting in that when he calls them, what you have is these four who were initially called, they were probably at a point in their life they realized the power elite in Jerusalem was really not speaking to them. They were longing to live their Jewish life in a more meaningful way, but they didn't know where to turn for it. And so Jesus calls out from within them, and this is what Logos does constantly, where the Logos calls forth in the Greek tradition, the spermatica, Logos spermatica. There's the seed in any of everyone, and when the sun or the light of the divine presence or Logos shines on that light, the petals begin to open and begin to break through the hard soil of time. And you get in John that everyone who is coming, pantos is the word, all who come into the world, that Logos, the light of it, the warmth of it, does shine on the seed deep within the human soul. And where there's people who receive it or accept it, then they are the ones that, in fact, their soul begins to open and the petals of their soul begin to blossom and inevitably bear much fruit. So the latter part of John 1, in fact, is the Logos speaking to the seed Logos in the first four that Jesus calls. And they're responding, others because the soil is hard or there's thorns in the soil. They don't heed, they don't hear, and this is where the collision inevitably becomes Jesus and the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, is that he comes, the divine Logos, calls that seed, but they are so set in their interpretations of what authentic Judaism is, in fact, will not, that budding will not occur for many of them anyway. No, that's not true with all of them. You hit John 2, which is very important because the first, what again John calls the first of Jesus's miracles, but the word arche is used yet once again. So it's the ground of all miracles. It's the myth. It's the portal that opens up to everything. So in John 2, you get the marriage, which is after 3 days. Oh, as soon as you hear 3, you know you're into death, resurrection. You know you're into Trinity. It's a portal leading into something. It's a marriage. Okay, so you've got the myth here very much of the bridegroom of mystical theology, which Origen is going to pick up, Bernard of Clairvaux. So the great theme of the Christian tradition, in fact, is people on their all too human journey, longing for meaning and understanding that in a festive marital context. The transition from water to wine, of course, you can read all these things literally, a literal wedding at Cana, but it's also much more moves from a literal to a typological to a tropological to an anagogical level. And so the other, of course, element of this is the water to wine. The water of our natural relationships are being transformed into the wine of supernatural relationships in this. So Cana is the first, or what is interpreted often as the first of the miracles, or signs, semeion, but in fact it's the ground of all miracles. Okay, the death, resurrection, the Trinity. So as we die to resurrect, we're raised up to the high order of divine life. The myth of the bridegroom is very important in all of that as well. And then the natural life of water being transformed into the supernatural of wine. So that can be read in a literal sense, a literal wedding, Cana of Galilee, wine, water changed into wine. But there's far more to what John is getting at, because John is just not a literal thinker. He'll start from the historic, literal, grammatical, but then all of that is a portal, or as he calls it, a semeion, a sign into a much more sophisticated and meaningful level. This is played out in part 2 of John 2, where he goes to the temple. Again, Passover. What is Passover? Passover within the Jewish tradition is where the Jews politically were liberated from the oppression of a pharaonic dynasty. Egypt became the symbol of political, economic oppression. And then they were liberated. They flee from Egypt, cross the desert, and then the promised land. Well, okay, so Jesus, so he goes to the Passover, which for a Jew would understand freedom from oppression, or freedom from the ego in the mystical sense, the Egypt of the false self, with all of its diversions and amusements. Crossing the desert where everything is barren, we have to let go of the ego of the desert, and then we enter the Jerusalem of our new being in that sense. So Jesus goes to the Passover. It can be interpreted as the historic event than the ritual, but he is the Passover. He is the one that leads people from the Egypt of their false self through the desert, where the ego all of a sudden dies. There's nothing in the desert, and then gradually as that dies, you enter the New Jerusalem. And so he sees himself in many ways as the Passover versus the historic ritual one, but also when he cleanses the temple. Here you have the literalists again, so we can do the literal Cana, we can do the literal Passover, or we do the literal temple. He says, 3 days from this temple is going to be destroyed. 3 days, so you get the three from Cana, now you got the 3 here, and I will rebuild it in 3 days. And of course the literalists will argue, well, it took decades for this to be built. How are you going to restore it in 3 days? They're thinking literally. He's thinking Christologically and metaphorically. You destroy this body. I am the temple. I am the Passover. Now, as C.S. Lewis once said, either the claims he's making, either this guy's mad, he's insane, or he's authentically who he claims to be. And if he is, we heed him. If we don't, we lock him up in an insane asylum, because the claims he's making are either extreme egocentrism or authentically true. So John 2b, the movement, both the Cana and the temple one, you move from the literal, historic, grammatical, which you can leave it at. Jesus is always confronting the literalists with the typological or the Christological, and they don't know what to do with it, because at a literal level it seems insane. You're going to rebuild the temple in 3 days? How do you rebuild a temple that took us quite a few decades to build? He's not talking about a literal temple. He's talking about, obviously, he is the temple. He is the Passover. He leads people from the Egypt of the false self, the desert, to the places where finally the false self cannot grow anymore. People have to let it go, and they move towards the new being of the New Jerusalem, metaphorically as well. John 3 hit exactly the same issue again. Nicodemus, Sanhedrin, Jewish leader. Now, he would have been probably a little wary of coming to see Jesus. So often what happens when you belong to a certain tribe and other people are seen as the problem, you're a bit hesitant of being seen with them. And Nicodemus was no different in that sense. And so interesting, the word Nicodemus, Nikao, just means overcomer. You get a word Nike shoes, just comes from a Greek word Nikao, and Nicodemus in that sense is the one who overcame his fears of being ostracized, marginalized by the tribe he belonged to, the inner ring he belonged to, and he took the chance of saying, I'm going to go and see this person who all my friends would think I should never go and see. He's a threat. He's a heretic to the Sanhedrin, to authentic Judaism. He goes to see him. And of course, then you get the literal typological again with Nicodemus, where Jesus says, well, you've got to be born again. And Nicodemus is thinking literally, you mean I got to be born from the womb, a literal? He's thinking literal, and Jesus says, no, spiritual rebirth, which goes back to John 1, which Jesus comes to birth a whole new level of existence in that sense. And so with the Nicodemus Jesus encounter, what you've got is once again the literalist engaging the typological or the Christological, that birth is not a literal thing. It's being midwifed into a total new being, which takes you, of course, right into Greek philosophy, is that you have to, and you get this birth-death theme very, very common in Greek thought, as you do in elements of Jewish thought and Roman thought. And it's only as we die, as we leave the womb, as we leave the egg, we leave the nest, that in fact we become new beings. And so what Jesus is saying to Nicodemus, if you are going to overcome, as your name implies, you're going to be victorious, because Nikao means not only overcoming, it means victorious in the overcoming. And it's more an issue mentioned earlier, an earlier Greek word that more meant intellectual, seeing the difference between darkness and light, but the will not as engaged as it could be. When you get to Nikao, which just means victory, overcoming, winning at the Olympics, which is Nicodemus means, that's much more the will. And so Jesus here, so just as in the Cana, you can interpret that literally. The temple, that can be interpreted literally, or it can be interpreted typologically, and then the impact morally is tropological. So in the Nicodemus encounter, this can occur this way as well, in terms of a birth into the new being and what that looks like. And so throughout John, he's constantly going to be moving at different interpretive levels. Most people will work just at the literal, historical, grammatical. He uses that as a sign, a semeion, or a portal into taking people into the spiritual meaning, or the allegorical meaning, or the typological, or the tropological. And this is where all great patristic theologians were constantly, they draw from the Johannine understanding of how the literal is but a portal, but when the literal becomes an end in itself, becomes an idol that blocks people, it shuts the doors of what is trying to be unconcealed, being concealed. And so this is where Jesus will again and again lock horns with those who think literal, historic, grammatical. And he says, I'm not going to deny that, but that is a portal or a sign into something much deeper, which is about being rebirthed, about a new being entirely, in which you leave the Egypt of the false self and enter the new Jerusalem. It's interesting that John, at the end of chapter 3, post the Nicodemus thing, he comes back to the wedding metaphor again of John 2, Cana of Galilee, and he sees himself as the friend of the bridegroom, because inevitably when you have spiritual leaders or gurus arise, people are drawn, particularly people are religiously hungry, they're looking for something more meaningful to live for other than bread and circuses. And inevitably, if they're not thoughtful, they get drawn to one guru, one prophet, one teacher after another. And so John the Baptist was very much waxing at the time. A lot of people were turning to him against the Jerusalem elite, the Sanhedrin, and John made it very clear, don't follow me. I'm just a pointer. I'm the friend of the bridegroom. So we're back to the wedding image again. Is this new vision which is coming to be? It's going to be like a great marriage feast. And so each person in that sense who heeds and hears the presencing of the divine is entered into this feast in which water is converted into wine. So almost elements of the Dionysian tradition as well, at a much more thoughtful way. Indeed. And so in John 1-3, then you have a whole range of literal events, if understood in a certain way, are portals or signs or semeions in that sense, that opens people to receive the presencing of that which is present. And so the heart of what John is getting at is that how does one remain present to the presencing of that which is present? And if people have literal interpretations, they're inevitably going to distort what that means and miss the whole meaning, where Jesus has come to unconceal much which has been concealed, and in the unconcealing, new clearings are found, but those clearings break substantively with the Jewish tradition. And the whole book of John is really a study of what he is saying, how many just don't understand it because they're literalists, those who do sort of get a sense that there is something going on here they don't understand, they're willing to break with Sanhedrin leadership. Many people feared following him because of what Jewish leadership would do. I mean, you get those things in anything where you break with a political party or you question it or question certain religious tendencies, and then you're seen as the problem or the enemy. And so you have many people at the time trying to figure out who is this person that doesn't fit into the categories that we thought defined genuine Judaism. And so even today, where people just think either or, are you on the left or the right? It'd be like asking Jesus, are you a Pharisee or a Sadducee? Well, I'm none of the above. Well, you must be a zealot. Are you a Maccabean, a political? No, I'm not that either. Are you an SE, Dead Sea Scrolls? No, not that either. Are you Herodian? Doesn't fit in either. And so there's a transcending of simplistic categories, because the mountain of who Jesus was, lesser people get a little acreage and they claim that's who Jesus was. And so they shrink Jesus to the acreage of their interpretation. This is what you get a lot of biblical exegetes today. So you'll get Jesus was a revolutionary, for example. The whole quest for the historic Jesus is about, was he a political revolutionary? Was he a mystic? Was he a Gnostic? Was he pointing to the end of time? Was he an eschatological thinker, apocalyptic thinker? Was he a rabbi? Was he a sage? Well, he was that. Was he a prophet, priest? Was he king? There's all of these. It's like the multifaceted colors of a diamond. When the sun of eternity shines on it, all those colors blend and come together. Lesser interpreters slip into various forms of reductionism because it simplifies, it makes things easier to understand, but when you get the presencing of that which is mysterious beyond our simple little categories and needs to make to define something, and you got something that blows to bits all those categories, it's how do you make sense? So who is he, and the claims he is making? John is really trying to grapple with this, and some want to say, well, how could someone like John, an illiterate fisherman, ever write anything like that? Well, John's journey himself is very much of grappling with a whole range of key issues, and whether you're a fisherman or you're a scholar, if you have a thoughtful person, they're going to grapple with the issues that come their way. And the book of John was written later in his life, in which he'd spent years reflecting upon his experience, challenges to certain interpretations of who Jesus was post-resurrection, ascension, and Pentecost. And then he's trying to articulate ways of understanding that are existentially relevant, that help people how you interpret a text in a far more subtle and nuanced way. And it prepares the way for later patristic exegesis, which was willing to see beyond the literal, was the allegorical, the typological, the tropological, anagogical, ecclesial, mystical, these various portals into the sanctuary or the cathedral of who Jesus was. So John 1-3 then, it opens up a way of approaching both the Jewish tradition, but if a person doesn't come from the Jewish tradition, isn't aware of those symbols, he uses other symbols coming from other heritages. So logos, well, this is a Greek term, darkness, light, rebirth, womb. You can go on and on. Wedding as a myth. The text itself is both Jewish oriented, but it's classically oriented, because the themes it deals with transcend the Jewish heritage themselves and deal with perennial symbols or myths that you will find in all the great traditions, which then Jesus is seen as the embodiment and the incarnation of. And we'll explore some of these even further as we then go past John 1-3.